So we're talking today about dimensionality reduction and clustering. And to go back to the beginning, we discussed how machine learning can help us with these large number of sensors or recording sites. And one way to deal with this large number of sensors is to cluster them into groups, which can help with uncovering similarities between different data instances that we didn't know were there. And another way to work with high numbers of sensors or recording sites is to use dimensionality reduction techniques, which uncover underlying processes that interact in simple or complex ways to give us our observed data. So both of these techniques are unsupervised, so they don't require labels for our data. And so far, what we've talked about is just supervised methods. So supervised methods require labels to do either classification or regression that we've talked about. So for example, we talked about KNN classifier, which took DTI fiber tracks, individual ones, and assigned them into anatomical bundles, so classified them into anatomical bundles. And in order to do this, we needed training data, so we needed individual fiber tracks with their assignments into anatomical bundles, which was given by human experts. And what we did was, when we got a new testing fiber track, we're able to look up which one in our training set it was closest to, or which K it was closest to, and assign the majority label to this new testing instance. So what if we have a lot of this unlabeled data? So we have a lot of these fiber tracks, but acquiring labels is expensive or impossible. So in this case, acquiring the labels is expensive because we're trying to get human experts to look at hundreds of thousands of fiber tracks and assign them into anatomical bundles. So this is quite effortful. But there are also cases where it's impossible to get labels. So for example, in resting state fMRI, if we want to assign brain states to different regions or time instances, there's no really ground truth. We don't really know what the real situation is in the brain. So these unsupervised methods can be used when we don't know the ground truth or we don't have a label for our data. So we'll discuss two such unsupervised methods today: dimensionality reduction and clustering. OK, so the dimensionality reduction techniques we'll discuss are three linear techniques: PCA, ICA, and CCA. Some of these are most likely familiar to you and you've used in your work, but I want to give you sort of an intuitive understanding of them. And a nonlinear technique, which is a Laplacian eigenmaps. And on the clustering side, we'll talk about the two different kinds of clustering algorithms and two of each kind. Okay. So to begin with the dimensionality reduction techniques. So why do we need dimensionality reduction? First off, we're dealing with very high dimensional data. So we have hundreds of fMRI voxels, thousands of fMRI voxels, and hundreds of sensors or sources in MEG, for example. However, the actual dimensionality of the information that is relevant to whatever we're interested in is likely low. So there can be redundant features, so redundant voxels that are very correlated with each other, that add more noise than actual signal. And this dimensionality of the relevant information really depends on the parameters we have that estimate describe the parameters, the probability density we're trying to estimate. So for supervised methods, if you remember, we're trying to estimate the probability of the labels given the data. So let's say we're assuming that the labels given the data follows some kind of Gaussian distribution. So we're trying to estimate the mean and the covariance. So these two parameters are the relevant information. And for unsupervised methods, we're just trying to estimate the probability of the data. OK, so as we see here, we can have the relevant information can be a lot more lower dimensional than our actual observations, which are very high dimensional. So we can use dimensionality reduction to sort of compress this high dimensional observation into lower dimensional features that are more, that help us more in, let's say, classifying something. OK, so our goal is to construct these features that better account for the variability in our data. So we can do this through combining highly correlated features and focusing on features that are uncorrelated or independent. And we have seen one way to do this already. Can anyone tell me what that was? Of getting rid of things that are correlated. That's one way to do it, yeah. I was thinking more generally, feature selection, right? So regularization, like we discussed in the homework, we can use L1, let's say, L1 penalty to push weights of features down to 0 and select the rest of them, right? Yeah. So exactly, so feature selection we've seen can do this, which removes directly subsets of observed features. And we have seen how this works in the context of a supervised task. So like with the, so where we want to maximize this mutual information between the labels and the selected features. However, when we don't have labels anymore, is there an alternative to this feature selection method? How can we apply this feature selection in unsupervised settings when we don't have labels? It turns out that it's not trivial how to do this. So it's not trivial how to select certain features that we think are relevant. So instead of doing feature selection in unsupervised settings, we can do this latent feature extraction. And when we say latent in machine learning, we mean something that's not observed. It's underlying the current observation. So it's some kind of process which is used to create this observed data. So usually this is what people think of, this latent feature extraction, when they say dimensionality reduction. OK, and what these methods do is they find some linear or nonlinear transformation of the observed data that provides more efficient representation than the observed data. So we can use these latent features that we extract from dimensionality reduction to, for example, classify better instead of using the raw observed data. Any questions about this? OK. So let's go through an example. So we have these 18 faces. How does the brain store these pictures of faces? So you can think of one way that the brain can store these pictures. It can store every single pixel in these pictures. So there's 64 by 64 pixels. So we can think of the brain as storing every single dimension. And in order to discriminate between, let's say, these two faces, the brain will need to compare every single pixel, right, if it's storing all the pixels. So it's a lot of dimensions. Is there something underlying this distribution of faces, these 18 faces? Are there more relevant dimensions than these 64 by 64 pixels? Because if we look at one particular pixel, let's say this one right here, it's not clear just based on this one value of this pixel what face we're looking at. It doesn't really narrow down much the space of faces. This pixel value is the same as the pixel value like right here and right here and right here and right here. So we can't discriminate between faces based on this 1 pixel value. So we can condense these 18 faces, or 64 by 64 pixels, into 3 dimensions, which are more relevant perceptually. So we have the up and down, we have the up and down pose, the right and left, and the lightning direction. So if we go back to the faces, we have this up and down, left and right, and we have this shading information also. So we can reduce the 64 by 64 space into just 3 dimensions that can help us discriminate between the faces a lot more easily than the 64 by 64 dimensions. So how do we actually find these latent dimensions? First, we need to ask ourselves, what kind of manifold does our observed data lie on? So does our observed data sort of look like it lies on a hyperplane, so it's more linear? If that's the case, then we use these linear dimensionality reduction techniques. If we think it's nonlinear, so it looks, let's say, like a Swiss roll, we can use nonlinear techniques such as Laplacian eigenmaps. There's also other different ones that a lot of them come from the linear methods and are extended to nonlinear methods. Any questions about this? So this is our observed data lies on sort of this manifold, and then we try to find the latent features that underlie this observed data. Yes?
So when you say whether it's linear or nonlinear, is that the correlation between the different voxels and pixels, or are you talking about overall the relationship between all of those linear outcomes?
So this would be, so there's no outcome. There's no labels whatsoever. Right? It's all just voxels. So this would be like, let's say we have, let's say we have 3-dimensional ROIs. So each of these axes would be the value of 1 voxel. So each of these dots here would be 1 ROI that has 3 voxels in it. So it would be like trying to plot, the ROIs in space, and you get sort of a linear relationship.
I don't understand the other one yet.
This would be the same thing, but instead of getting sort of a linear relationship, you get this thing. Yeah, in 3D space. Usually these are much higher dimensional, right? Because we have like 100 or 1,000 voxels. So it's hard to imagine, but this is sort of the intuition in 3D space. Yeah, good question. Mm-hmm.
Is there like a principled way to kind of determine whether it's linear or nonlinear?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Principled, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's kind of an art, and people usually use whatever works best. It's a lot of high-dimensional data. It always looks nonlinear, but people think that when they assume a linear manifold for the observed data, it's good enough. So, like a lot of people use these linear methods. Just close the door. And they work pretty well, I guess. Yeah. So you can use a nonlinear method if the other ones don't work, basically. Yeah.
Fair. Thanks.
Did you have a question?
So they don't check if it's linear or nonlinear using a dimension. I know it's hard in high dimension.
It's very hard to, the problem is it's very hard to visualize, right? So in 3 dimensions, it's easy. But when you have 100 dimensions, it's quite hard. Yeah. Yeah. OK. So to begin with the linear methods, first we're going to talk about PCA, which you're probably very familiar with. But just as a refresher, PCA identifies these axes of latent low-dimensional linear subspaces of the features. So let's say this is our observed data, so it's in 3D. And what PCA does is it identifies these axes of the linear subspace, of the linear latent space. And it identifies that it only needs 2 dimensions to really describe this observed data. So here, the observed data is this big D dimension of 3, and the latent data, the latent features are with dimension 2. So here, the assumption is that this observed data lies on a linear subspace. And we think that we can use the axes of this latent features to effectively represent the data. So what does really effective representation mean, right? So we touched on this a little bit, but basically it means that through this latent representation, we're more able to distinguish between data instances than in the observed raw state. So we're more likely to tell instances apart when they truly are apart, and not just due to noise or other reasons. And so our goal is to identify these axes of the latent space. And these are also known as principal components. So the intuition behind the algorithm is that, first of all, the PCs are orthogonal to each other because they're axes of this latent space. And then they're the directions that capture most of the variance of the data. So if we have this blue dots are our observations, this red line here is our first principal component. And they're also ordered so that the first principal component is the direction of greatest variability. And the second one is the second greatest, and so on. So we can project this data point, the black one, let's say, along the first principal component. And this is the way to discriminate this data point along any direction if we actually project it to the first principal component. Here I've just shown the projection. So this is the first principal component, and this is the data point. So we project it here, which is the blue. And then we can also get the second principal component, and so on. And once we have computed the PCs, we can get this new features from the observed data. So the original one was a d-dimensional data. So this is just one data instance. We can think of it as, let's say, one ROI. And these are all the voxels in the ROI. So they're big D voxels in the ROI. But once we have once we have done PCA on it, now it's reduced in dimension. It's small d. And the way we compute it is by doing the projection along these small d number of principal components. And then we can also think of PCA as sort of a matrix factorization problem. So if we have all the data here, we can factorize it in a matrix that it has only the principal components and then other things we don't care as much about. So here the main idea is that M here, the number of principal components, is smaller than the dimensionality of our data. So we have reduced the dimensionality. So we're doing compression. We can also determine how many PCs we need, sort of in a heuristic way. So we can plot how much variance is explained by each PC. And then because they're ordered from first being the most, the one that explains the most variance, we can do a cumulative plot of the variance explained. And then cut off wherever we think we've explained enough variance, or look for sort of a difference in, a large difference in variance explanation between consecutive PCs. And the takeaways from a PCA is that it's a linear dimensionality reduction technique, so it assumes that your latent space is linear, not the latent space, that your observed data lies on a linear space. So we are limited to these linear projections. And it also has an exact solution. So it's not iterative, which is fast. And there's no local optima, which is good. There's no tuning parameters, which is great. And it also, just note that the PCA assumes that your data is centered, so we want to subtract the mean of your data. And PCs are orthogonal. So this last point, that the PCs are orthogonal, can be sort of investigated in more detail. Do we need our components to be orthogonal? Right? So if you have this data, this yellow observed data here, PCA would be looking for two components that are orthogonal to each other, but our data is clearly not orthogonal to each other. It's sort of at this angle. But it still looks like it's pretty independent. So can we have components that are not orthogonal? It turns out that we can, and this is what independent component analysis does. Instead of assuming that components are orthogonal or requesting that they are, it requests they're statistically independent. So then what ICA sort of intuitively does is it looks for a way to separate our observed data into these underlying signals that have been mixed. So a very prototypical example of ICA is this cocktail party sort of phenomena. So let's say we have four things are making noise, and we have 4 microphones in some space, and we're trying to get the signal that corresponds to each of these sources separately. So we're trying to get a clean signal of this ambulance, or whatever this is. And it's very hard to do that because the signals have been mixed. So each microphone records a signal from all of these sources, as these lines suggest. Right? So ICA helps us demix these original signals from the sources. So we have the underlying sources and the mixed observations. So ICA works on the mixed observations and wants to output these separate sources. So the similarities between PCA and ICA are that they're both linear methods. So they perform linear transformations. And they both can be formulated as a matrix factorization problem. So to remind you, PCA can be formulated as such. And ICA is very similar, but it does not compress the number of components here. So it's the same number of components as we had dimensions. So instead of compressing, this tries to remove dependencies in our original data. OK, and then the differences between PCA and ICA. So again, PCA does compression, where ICA does not. So it outputs the same number of features as we've inputted. PCA removes correlations, but not higher order dependence between features. And ICA removes correlations and higher order dependence. So PCA has some components that are more important than others. So the first one explains the most variance, why ICA does not. And in PCA, the components are orthogonal, where in ICA, they're statistically independent. So the takeaways from ICA, ICA is a linear method. So it makes the assumption that your observations lie on a linear manifold. And it tries to separate the observed data instances into these sources. So unlike PCA, the components are not orthogonal, but are statistically independent. And it's commonly used for denoising or source localization in neuroscience. I'm sure many of you have used it before. Right? OK. Yeah, that's OK. OK. Cool. Let's talk about something that may be new to some of you. What if we're interested in explaining variance in multiple data sets at the same time? So far we talked about trying to do PCA or ICA on one data set and trying to reduce it in dimension or demix it. But what do we have if we have two data sets? So we have this data set A and data set B, and we're trying to learn some common latent representation of both, and trying to learn a way to transform both data sets into this latent common representation. So an example of this is, let's say we have a simultaneous recording of nurse and fMRI. So this is the nurse recording, this is the fMRI recording. And we ask, can we try to find a common brain process between these two? So we know that they're simultaneous recordings, so they're recording the same sort of information, but they're representing it in different ways. So can we uncover a common latent representation of both of these? So a way to do this is called canonical correlation analysis. And what this basically does is it finds a way to transform the data sets into a latent space in which the transformed data sets are most correlated. So it tries to maximize the correlation of these transformed data sets into the latent dimension. Is this conceptually clear? I'm going to go through an example. Okay. Okay, but again, so we're trying to find, so there is a latent representation that's common to both data sets. And what CCA does is it finds a way to transform the observed data into two projected data into the latent space that are most correlated with each other. Okay. So let's go through an example. So this example will be about how we can discover shared semantic space between different people and across different experiments. We're going to start small, though. We're going to talk about using linear regression first, and then build to semantics between people. So we'll talk about semantics within a person first. So we can think of the following goal. So we can try to find a generative theory of how words are represented in the brain. So we can start with an arbitrary word. Here we have some black box theory. And then we want to predict the brain activity. Let's say we predict fMRI activity from this arbitrary word, given our theory, right? So what we want is to generate this theory. So let's say we're presenting words to subjects in an fMRI, one at a time. So we aim to use this fMRI data that we get from the presentations, along with the corresponding word label, so the word that was presented to the participant, plus the fMRI data that corresponds to it, to train this model in order to be able to give it an arbitrary word that we haven't shown the participants and generate some fMRI activity. Okay, so one way to do this is this is an example of something done by Tom Mitchell here at CMU. It was published in Science in 2008. So the way that they did this was by using what is called statistical co-occurrence statistics of a certain word with different words. So the reason why we have to use this is that we want to represent an arbitrary word in some way. And a computer doesn't really know what a representation of a word, arbitrary word is, unless you tell it to. So we can use these statistics that we take from billions of documents online from Google to estimate how often, let's say, an arbitrary word like telephone occurs with 25 verbs. Let's say the verbs are eat, eat. I'll show you some examples in a little bit. But yeah, so we have 25 verbs that we have sort of not completely arbitrary, but decided beforehand. And we can now find the values of how often this word occurs with these verbs from statistics online. And I'll show you examples of what these values can be. So there's 25 values. And then what we can do is we are trained, the way we train this model is we put people in the scanner. We don't show them telephone. We show them bottle, let's say. So we show the person bottle. We record their fMRI activity during seeing bottle. Then we get the co-occurrence statistics of bottle with these 25 verbs. And we can train a linear regression model from these co-occurrence statistics to the fMRI. So we can train a way to transform the statistics into fMRI voxels. So we learn these weights here, basically. And now, OK, let me just show you really quickly the semantic features. So these co-occurrence statistics for two words that were presented, so celery and airplane. So here we have the verbs that are eat, taste, fill, see. So celery has a higher number for eat and taste than it does for drive. Right, or where's ride? Ride, it has 0 for ride because we don't ride celery usually, right? So this was taken from these billions of documents online. So this is how often celery occurs with each of these verbs. And then we can also do the same thing for airplane. And here we see that ride is a lot more frequently occurring with airplane than it does with celery, right? So this is good. So these are the values here that we use for training this model. So what we train is these weights here from the co-occurrence statistics to the observed fMRI data. OK, is it clear what happens at training here? So the only thing we have is these co-occurrence statistics of 60 words we have presented in the scanner and fMRI, corresponding fMRI pictures. OK, so now the way we apply this model is we take any given word that was not presented in the scanner. We get its co-occurrence statistics from the internet, and we apply these weights that we learned. And now we have an fMRI image, right, for an arbitrary word. Questions?
Where is the correlation here, like the CCA part?
It's not coming in yet. So this is for one subject. This is within a subject, yeah. We'll talk about how to use CCA to do this for multiple subjects.
And the mapping, like how is the mapping learned? Like is it
Just linear regression. It's regularized with an L2 penalty.
Oh, that's why you said the betas are.
The betas, yeah. The betas are over here, that thing. Yeah. This is just showing us getting the semantic vectors. Yeah. Yeah, good questions. OK, so but how do we evaluate this model? How do we know it does fine? Because we don't have the fMRI images that correspond to any arbitrary word, right? So there's no ground truth for evaluation. So what we can do is we can do the leave 2 out cross-validation, where we train on only 58 of the 60 words and their corresponding fMRI images. So we leave 2 of the words out. So the model has never seen these words before. So it's like as though these 2 are arbitrary words the model has just never seen. So we can apply this model on the remaining 2 words and predict the corresponding fMRI images. And then what we can do is we can show the model the true fMRI images corresponding to the held out 2 words. And we can ask it to guess which of these true images corresponds to each word. So what the model knows is which word corresponds to which predicted image, but it doesn't know which word corresponds to which true image. So the way that it decides this is by computing the difference between the predicted image and the true image. And it chooses the one that's the predicted image is closest to. So there's 60 words, so we choose 2 of them at a time. So there's 60 choose 2 ways to do this cross-validation. So there's this many folds. So the random guessing accuracy here is we have 2 images, and we guess which one is which, right? Which one is which word. So it's 50% is the true accuracy, the random accuracy. And we've calculated with permutation test that in order to get below 0.05 alpha level p-value, we need 0.61 accuracy. And we can calculate this accuracy from this guessing across 9 subjects, and it's 0.79. So it's well above this significance threshold of 0.61. So this is across 9 subjects. So it's not combining data from the 9 subjects. It's doing this on each individual subject and averaging over the 9 subjects. So we have a way to predict this fMRI activation corresponding to any word, like arbitrary word, the model has never seen before. So it's pretty exciting. And it does this well, 0.79 accuracy. Any questions about this?
So you have like different arbitrary words, and you're trying to predict from words to MRI image. So do you see different MRI images between very different words?
Yes, yes. So the words, the 60 words came from 12 different categories, like tools, food, etc. And there's actually, the results were, the predicted brain images sort of showed things that were manipulable, like tools, light up certain areas, while like food lights up different areas. And there's definitely differences between the different categories that were greater than this 0.79%. Yeah, you can distinguish two words from 2 different categories much more easily than any 2 words. Yeah, so there's definitely differences between different categories. Yeah, does this answer your question?
But you said the fMRI activation is by showing something. It's not by the word. When you're training.
When you're training it, yes. But when you're testing, it just with this literal word. So the word telephone. So the word telephone, this is all you input into the system is the word telephone.
Mm-hmm.
There's no fMRI activity associated with telephone. Right, yeah.
So while training, there is the image that you showed there, like with respect to when you do regression
Mm-hmm.
on the workflow. So you just get those ones which are maximum correlated, or so how is that?
You're talking about feature selection right now?
No. So this one you said the predicted activity for telephone. So you predicted.
This is for each voxel in the brain. So this was. So the way that the regression is done, you're asking, well, like what's on the right side of the regression?
Yeah.
What's on the right side of regression is different ROIs containing some number of voxels. So for each ROI, you do this regression. So just a huge matrix.
But that is not related to telephone initially.
That is not related to telephone. So a training
Okay.
is just the words we showed, like celery and airplane and bottle. Telephone is not shown.
Okay.
Yeah, but this accuracy, because we don't have a way of computing an accuracy of an arbitrary word, we did leave 2 out here. So there's no telephone in this test set. Okay. Okay, so now how does CCA come in? We want to extend this model to multiple subjects to improve our accuracy, because we think that perhaps looking at semantics that is common across people can help us, instead of looking at semantics that are common for a certain person. So the way we do CCA here, this is a little bit of a busy slide, but I'll walk you through it. So here we have stacked data for the 9 subjects from our experiment. And we also have data for some number of subjects here from a different experiment, which was the word. So here's the word only. So just bottle, celery, airplane was presented to the person, like the word as written. And here is the word plus a picture. So it's a picture of a celery with the word written celery underneath. So these are 2 different experiments and subjects from both experiments. And here we're using CCA to train a more generalized version of CCA, which can handle multiple data sets, not just two. So we're trying to uncover how to transform these representations, these different subjects, into one latent common space here. And this common space is a little bit different from what we described before. But they're learned from this other features. So we have other types of features, which were actually questions answered by people in Mechanical Turk about the 60 words. And we did a linear regression between these features that were questions answered by Mechanical Turk people to some latent features here. So CCA comes in this stage here, the way we do the transformation from these separate subjects into one common latent space. So what we end up doing at the end is we have a new word, arbitrary word. So we've trained this model, let's say. We've learned these weights and these weights. CCA gives us these weights here. Linear regression gives us these weights. So the way we test this is we get an arbitrary word, telephone. We have these answers of people in Mechanical Turk that correspond to telephone. We apply these linear weights, learned from linear regression. We get these latent features. And then we have these ways to transform the data here. That gives us predictions for each subject separately. And by using this method, we can do the same task again when we leave two words out, and we try to guess the label of each of the words we have left out, and we get an improvement by 8% in this classification. Yes?
The transformation of the feature into the fMRI map, you said that CCA learns that.
Yes.
But you have a set of features per subject, right? It's not like common, identical for all subjects.
So the picture is a little bit less clear, but these features, so we have a way to transform these subjects into like transformed features. And these transformed features now are maximally correlated with each other. So you're right, there's a set of features, these features for each of these persons, right? And these features are maximally correlated for like the first person and the 10th person and the 20th person, yeah. Someone else had a question?
I was just gonna, so when you're feeding the word into the model, do you give it more information than just the word and the fMRI? Like, do you give it categories and how
You're talking about the training?
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
no. So just the labels, so the word that was presented and the fMRI image during the presentation of the word. So no information about categories.
What if you had two words that are like similar looking, but they have totally different meanings, like RED and REA?
Yeah, so that problem was avoided cleverly by picking concrete nouns that were presented, so like celery and plane. So that is a problem, and I think this is one of the reasons this model performs better, because it's using features that were answered by people about a certain word also. So it has this like human factor in addition to like having CCA. Yeah, but it's a good question. This kind of model probably won't be able to dissociate. Yeah.
So just one last question on CCA. The maps are the things that are maximum correlated.
The mappings of the original data into the common space, not the maps themselves. So you learn the map that increases that maximizes the correlation after the data has been mapped. So when you apply these weights here to the space, yeah.
The blue dots depend on whatever the person or the people answered in the questionnaire. And it will be different for every person.
So they don't depend on them. Like you learn, yeah, sure, they depend, but you learn this dependence through linear regression. Let's talk after. Yeah, maybe it'd be more clear.
20 learned features, like there are like 20 learned latent features.
Yeah, so they're not, they could be interpretable, but these are not interpretable, I would say.
So that is where.
So they're just numbers.
Those are like 20 from 20 different subjects, or is it?
No, no. So there are 20 per subject, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
And those are based on CCA. That's where the CCA comes in.
Yes, CCA comes into transforming each individual observed data for the subjects into these blue dots for each subject that are maximally correlated with each other. So if it's a vector, we have like a vector for each of these subjects, and we do correlation of this vector with this vector, and like all the vectors, they're maximally correlated. So CCA has learned the way to get this into these blue dots that produces vectors that are most correlated. Okay. Okay, let's see. Let's take a break. Oh, okay. Let's do takeaways, and then we take a break. So takeaways from CCA. We learned that CCA learns this linear transformation of multiple data sets into some latent space, and this transformed data sets are maximally correlated. And in neuroscience, this can be used to extend models of multiple subjects to, or experiments to of single subjects to multiple subjects. Okay, let's take a break, 5-minute break. And CCA finished up our linear dimensionality reduction part of the lecture. So now we're go beyond linear transformations, and we're going to talk about Laplacian eigenmaps. So linear methods find this lower dimensional linear projections that preserve the distance between all points in the data. While Laplacian eigenmaps, the main idea here is that they want to preserve local informations. So if you imagine this Swiss roll here, what we want to do is unroll it. So this is our observed data. What we want to find, this observed data lies on sort of like a rectangular manifold, like latent manifold, right? If we unroll it, we get this rectangle here. And this is what we want as the output. However, if we use a linear method, it will try to preserve all points between, all distances between the original points, so you won't be able to unroll it, sort of collapse. And this Laplacian eigenmaps wants to preserve the local points, so it will keep sort of here these points together while allowing for points, let's say here and here, which are still relatively close, but not as close as like those here in this location to go apart. Okay, so we'll go through this in not that much detail, but if you're interested, I can point you to documentation about this. It's also implemented by the scikit-learn module. We can read about it there. Okay, so there are 3 steps to constructing the Laplacian eigenmaps. The first step is construct a graph, and I'll explain a little bit how to do that. Then to compute a graph Laplacian, and then embed the points using this graph Laplacian. So step 1 is constructing a similarity graph. So here we have this observed data, and we want to construct a graph that tells us how similar points are on this observed data. how similar different data instances are to each other. So this will allow us to then have a sense of what these local relationships that we need to preserve are when we try to unroll the Swiss roll. Yeah. Let's talk about the weights, and then we can how to get the weights. Yeah. So so we don't have this graph, right? We start out with this observed data, and we want to build a graph. So what is a graph? We can describe a graph fully by the number of vertices it has and which vertices it has, the edges between vertices, and the weights on these edges. So the vertices are these points. The edges are all the edges between the vertices, and the weights are the strength of the edges. So the vertices are all data points. So all of these little dots, these are the vertices of the graph. So how do we construct the edges? There are two main ways. One way is to put an edge between two data instances or two vertices if they're within some distance of each other, this epsilon distance. And we'll talk about how to how to find what epsilon should be later. But this sort of induces this locality of the graph, because if epsilon is bigger, then we'll put edges between data points and more data points, right? So the neighborhood of the graph will be larger. And we'll try to preserve more of these connections. The second way is to use k-nearest neighbors, what we've talked about. So we put two data points, an edge between two data points, if one is a nearest neighbor of another. And this can lead to three types of graphs. So we can do this in three ways. One way is we put an edge if data point A is a nearest neighbor of B, so within k nearest neighbors of B. And this leads to a directed graph. So we ask, is A a nearest neighbor of B? If so, put an edge between them. Is B a nearest neighbor of A? If so, put an edge between them, and so on. And this is a directed graph. Another way to do this is ask whether either A is a nearest neighbor of B or B is a nearest neighbor of A. And this results in an undirected symmetric graph, right? Because we just put an edge if either one is a nearest neighbor of the other. So there's no notion of directionality here. And the last way is if we put an edge only if they're both nearest neighbors of one another, right? So maybe you're asking, how can one be a nearest neighbor of another, but the other one can't be of the first one? Well, we have this notion of k nearest neighbors, right? So it's within 3. So if one data point is closer to another 3 data points than this fourth one, maybe I should have a graph, but it can happen, especially with these like number of points in here. So let's see. If we have one point over here, let's say, right, this like very end point, and it's, let's say we're looking at k equals 3, and there are 3 points here, and one of these, either one of these can be, there can be an edge between these. But when we look at the 3 nearest points, nearest neighbors of one of these other 3, it's not necessarily this first one. So this is how it can happen that 2 points are not nearest neighbors of each other. Anyway, so this is a way to construct these edges between the data points. So we have a way of finding the vertices in the graph. We have a way of constructing the edges. What about the strength of the edges, or the weights? So there are 2 ways to do this too. One, the simplest way is to say that an edge has a weight 1 if there is an edge between I and j and 0 otherwise, right? So it's sort of a binary graph. But another way is to sort of do this Gaussian kernel where we put an edge the weight depends on the similarity between the data points. So here we have the Euclidean distance between two data points. And it's e to this Euclidean distance divided by some kind of constant here. So it's kind of, the Gaussian kernel is sort of a smooth like similarity measure between data points. So we assign a weight to an edge according to how similar the points that this edge connects are. Okay, so this weights you can think of as a matrix where we have, let's say we have 100 data points. So we have 100 vertices in our graph. So W will be a matrix of 100 by 100, where each element of the matrix will be the weight of the edge between two vertices, right? So between the ith and the jth vertex. Is this clear? Okay. Okay, so now we have a graph, right? So we have a complete graph. We have the vertices, the edges, and the weights on these edges. How do we choose k for the k nearest neighbors or epsilon for the epsilon neighborhood of the graph? So we, again, want to preserve local information. So we don't want to make them too big, because then we'll get situations where sort of this part of the Swiss roll is in the neighborhood of this part of the Swiss roll, and we'll try to preserve that, and it won't unroll. So we don't want to pick some that are too large. So this is most dependent on the data. So because we want to avoid, like I said, these shortcuts that connect to different parts of the Swiss roll. So we can use something like cross-validation to do this. Okay, so the step 2. So step 1 was construct the graph. Step 2 was compute the graph Laplacian, which is just equal to this degree matrix minus the weight matrix. So the weight matrix is just this matrix of n voxels or n vertices by n vertices. And the D is the degree matrix, where each element is a diagonal matrix, which is n by n again. And each element of the diagonal is the degree of the corresponding vertex. So the degree means it's the sum of all the weights that connect to it. So here, the degree of this node I would be the sum of all the weights that connect to node I. Okay. So I'm just telling you this because the graph Laplacian is used to do the embeddings. So here, once we have done the embedding using the graph Laplacian, I'll give you a little bit more intuition of how that's done. But once we have done it, the original data was big D dimensional, and the projections are of some vector f, of some function f that we have applied to this data instance. So it's a d-dimensional, small d-dimensional vector now. So the intuition behind this is that we want to find a function f such that if the original data points xi and xj are close in the graph, so if this wij, the weight of the edge between them, is big, then we want the projections to also be close. So the way we do this, just very briefly, is we find the eigenvectors of the graph Laplacian, this like weight matrix minus the degree matrix minus the weight matrix. And then to embed these data points to get these values, we project the data into the eigenvectors that are associated with the smallest eigenvalues. So this is just to give you a sense of what the Laplacian eigenmaps does. But the intuitive thing is that it tries to preserve the local information. So when points are close together in the original space, it wants them to be close together in the output latent space as well. So this is what allows us to unroll the Swiss roll. Okay, So these are examples of using Laplacian eigenmaps on the Swiss roll. This is as we increase the number of nearest neighbors this way. And t here is increased this way, which is the kernel parameter, which is a parameter on this Gaussian kernel that we use to construct the weights. Okay, so we see here that as we increase the number of neighbors, so as we go this way to the right, the structure sort of collapses because we are not preserving as much local information anymore. We're looking at a larger number of nearest neighbors. So we get like this sort of thing that's not useful. I don't have as much of an intuition of what the heat kernel parameter here does, but it does something. It looks like it's less important than the neighbors, but it can be.
The variance in the Gaussian kernel?
Yeah.
And it acts like the epsilon in a way.
Yeah, but it's on the weight, so it's sort of the smoothness of it all. Yeah, it's smoothness, but what I mean is intuitively it should influence how smooth this result is. Increasing it should result in more smooth results, which.
Actually, I think it's the opposite. If you increase it, then it's like you're saying long connections are important. So if
Right.
you reduce it, then it,
If you reduce it, you would get like more local results, right? So that's what I mean by smooth. So it would be like a smoother transition to like the farthest points. Yeah, but I think we have the same intuition, yeah. Yeah, I don't think we see that as much here in like this sort of thing, but I think it's important to note the number of neighbors. Okay, so takeaways from the Laplacian eigenmaps. It's the one way we discussed to do nonlinear dimensionality reduction, and it aims to preserve this local information. And there are 3 main steps that we discussed to it. Okay, so now we're done with dimensionality reduction. To go back to the beginning when we talked about supervised versus unsupervised learning, we finished discussing dimensionality reduction, and now we're on to clustering.
Before you move on, it just wasn't clear when you say you have to project on the eigenvector. Isn't the projection linear?
The projection,
I mean, it's a projection on the graph, off the graph, but that projection is linear. Or am I missing? Where is the nonlinear transformation?
So these eigenvectors are from the transformation is
So that's what yeah, there is a nonlinear transformation at some point, but the projection on eigenvectors is by definition linear. Just the projection itself.
yes. Hold on.
Is it the graph, the difference between degrees and length that induces?
Yes. So I'm trying to think. That definitely is true. That's nonlinear. But I'm trying to think of your point about the transformation being a linear projection, right? Yeah, I'll get back to you on that. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so now we're going to talk about clustering. Okay, so in the beginning we talked about using KNN to classify these fibers into anatomical bundles, right? But what happens when we don't have labels? So we want to reduce the human effort because human labels are sometimes error prone and also take effort, right? So we want to take the human out of the loop. So can we just have this as input, these fiber tracks, and get these anatomical bundles as output? Can we use clustering to cluster these fibers into anatomical bundles without any training instances? Okay, so what is clustering? Clustering is a way to organize data into groups or clusters such that two things are true. There's high similarity within each cluster, and there's low similarity between clusters. So each of these clusters would have high similarity within it and less of a similarity between data in this cluster and data in this other cluster. So again, it's unsupervised, so we do not rely on labels to do the clustering. Okay, but this notion of similarity is an interesting one. Like, what does it really mean to have high similarity within cluster and low similarity between clusters? So similarity is really any function that takes data as input, different data as input, and produces a real number, which tells you how similar these things are. And an example of this is Euclidean distance, which is a measure of dissimilarity, right? So if two things are farther apart in Euclidean distance, so if the Euclidean distance is greater between two things, they're more dissimilar. So that's one example. Another example is correlation. So the more correlated things are, the more similar they are. So these are two examples of similarity functions. Okay, so to go back to clustering algorithms divide into two main types. One is the partitional algorithm type, which looks at the entire data and it constructs various partitions of it and evaluates these partitions by some criterion, how good these partitions are. So here we have these Simpsons characters, and we're trying to cluster them according to some internal dimension, let's say. So maybe we're trying to cluster the Simpsons and the non-Simpsons, the people in the Simpsons family versus the non-Simpsons. So this is what partitional algorithm does. It creates non-overlapping clusters from the data. And the second type of clustering is hierarchical algorithms, which create this hierarchical decompositions of the objects. So there are sort of two ways to do this, going from bottom up and top down, and we'll discuss that as well. Okay, so first the partitional clustering. So here we have this as input, so all the people, and we try to cluster them into, let's say, women and men. We can do this by using partitional clustering, which places each of these data instances into non-overlapping clusters. And the number of clusters, though, has to be specified before running this algorithm, because they're non-overlapping, and our algorithm doesn't have a way of choosing its own cluster number. So here we have chosen 2 clusters, and the algorithm has decided that this is the best way to split the data into 2 clusters. And we'll discuss 2 algorithms that are partitional. One is k-means, and the other one is spectral clustering. Okay, so there are 4 steps to k-means. And I'll give you an example right after this. So first is we input the desired number of clusters, k, because the partition algorithm, and we need to do that. Then we initialize where the k cluster centers will be. We can do this randomly. And then we iterate through first assigning all data instances to the nearest cluster. And we re-estimate the k cluster centers. And we terminate if none of the assignments have changed in this last iteration. So let's go through an example. We have these data instances, the blue ones. And we have chosen 3 clusters. We decided that 3 clusters is the best. And we initialize the points of the centers of the clusters as these k1, k2, and k3. So this was step 1 and step 2 together. Step 3 is to assign all the data points to the nearest cluster center. So we assigned this data point to K3 because it was closer to K3 than K1 or K2. And I have plotted sort of this diagram here to show you the separations between the clusters. Okay, so this was assigning all the data to nearest cluster. And then we re-estimate the K cluster means. So we move them to wherever the new mean of the cluster is. And then we reassign the data to the nearest cluster again. So we color these now blue because they're closer to the new K3. And we move the clusters again, and we do this until we're done. So there's no change in assignments anymore. So these are the 3 final clusters. Okay. Is that clear? Okay. So problems. There's many problems with k-means. One is that it's very sensitive to where you initialize the centers of the clusters. So let's say we have this data to begin with, and we initialize these 3 random starting points for the cluster means. So we iterate through, and we end up assigning this data here in this one very clear cluster to these 2 different clusters. And this will not change as we iterate, because these points are closer to this cluster, and these are closer to this cluster. So they won't separate. I mean, they won't be combined into one cluster. So it's very important when you're using k-means to try different initializations of the cluster centers. And also, there's this initialization method called k-means plus, which initializes the cluster means so that they're generally most distant from each other. So this allows us to sort of avoid this situation here. We would get, with k++, we would get means that are more in all 3 clusters. And this is provably gives us better results than the random initialization. So I recommend highly, if you use k-means, to use k-means++. And this scikit-learn module has this initialization built, but you have to specify it. OK, so how do we choose k, though? That's a big problem, because if you're working with high-dimensional data, it's very hard to visualize it and sort of see, oh, yeah, I have these 3 clusters that are happening. First is to look at the objective function of k-means. So here, the x's are the data instances. The mu's are the centers of the clusters. And we have m clusters here. So what it's saying is we want to minimize the distance between the data points and centers of clusters. Or rather, its objective function is just the distance between the points with the data points and the center clusters. So one way to choose k is to plot the value of this function for different values of m, which is the number of clusters. So yeah, k, whatever. So here is the objective function value. So this value here, this number, plotted as a function of k. So we see this knee or elbow, it's called, here. And we, in practice, we look for this, and we determine that 2 clusters is the best here, because it gave us greatest reduction in the objective function. And the question is, can we choose k by minimizing this objective function? Sort of like maximum likelihood estimate, or anything that we have used before. Can we use this kind of idea to minimize this objective function? So the problem with this sort of way to choose k is that this will be minimized when we have as many clusters as we have data points. Because then the distance between the mean of the cluster and a data point will be 0, right? So this value will be 0 here. So in reality, this objective function will basically keep decreasing until it hits 0 at some point. And obviously, this is not something we want because we don't want each data point to be in its own cluster. We want to group them together. So we can't minimize the objective here, but we can use cross-validation. We just can't just minimize this objective function. OK, so the last problem with k-means, well, that we discuss here is that it assumes convexity of clusters. So can you tell me which of these k-means will do better on? Which of these two different data? How would k-means do on this, according to this assumption? Convex clusters. Convex means that basically you can't draw a line between two data points that is outside the cluster. So every line you draw between two data points falls within the cluster. That's what convex means. So k-means should do pretty well on this because they're sort of circular, which is convex. Here, though, if we try to use k-means on this, it will fail because this cluster is basically within this other cluster. OK, so we'll show you a picture in a little bit. So the takeaways is that k-means is simple and iterative, and it does clustering, which is grouping of values, of data values. But it's sensitive to initialization, and I recommend using k-means ++ if you try to use k-means for that. It assumes convexity of clusters. So what happens when we can't make this assumption? And what we can do is we can first do Laplacian eigenmaps to reduce the dimensionality of the data, and then do k-means on the reduced latent features to get a better clustering. So I'll show you an example, but this is called spectral clustering. So first doing Laplacian eigenmaps and then applying k-means to cluster the latent features. OK, so let's go through this example. So first we construct a graph from Laplacian eigenmaps. First constructs a graph from our data. So we have this data here, these 3 concentric circles. And we construct a graph which looks at the similarity between different data points, or how close the data points are. So if we're constructing a good graph, and we have clusters that are separable like this, we should get a graph that has subgraphs that are not connected to each other. So we should get a graph that has 0 weight edges between certain points, right? Because there's no connection between the points over here and the points over here, right? They're not close together. So if they are separable clusters, we expect to have good graphs that have disconnected subgraphs. And then we can apply, we can do the embedding with the eigenvectors. And we basically get these 3 points here. And then from that, we can go to the original space and be able to label. So here we can use k-means to separate those 3. And then we can go back to the original space and label each of the original data with the final clusters. So the points, the intuition behind this is the points are easier to cluster in this embedded lower dimensional space using k-means, because k-means will fail on something that looks like this, but k-means does pretty well on something that looks like this. And this does pretty well in practice, actually. But it still has some problems, like it has all the problems that Laplacian eigenmaps have. So we have to choose this k for the k and n, or this epsilon for the neighborhood. And we also need to choose a number of clusters. But the most stable clustering is usually given by the number of clusters that maximize this, the difference between two consecutive eigenvalues when we compute the Laplacian eigenmap. Anyway, so this is showing for two different k's. So this is k equals 3 and k equal to 2, the output, right? So it's subjective. So clustering in general is subjective. There's no ground truth. So sometimes it's hard to evaluate because we don't have labels, right? But we still need a way to determine the number of clusters. So spectral clustering versus k-means. Can you tell me which one of these is k-means? The left. Yes. So the left is k-means. It does poorly. It's kind of a mess, right? So it definitely does not separate this inner cluster with this outer cluster. And the right side is spectral clustering, so it does much better. Yeah. OK, so the takeaways. Clustering is the second type of partitional clustering algorithms we discussed. It can deal with non-convex clusters, and it first performs Laplacian eigenmaps and then clusters the embedded points using k-means. But we still need to choose k. So let's move on to algorithms that we don't need to choose k for. These are the hierarchical algorithms. So these, again, create this hierarchical decomposition of the data. So there are two types of this. One is the top-down type, which looks at all the data at the same time and then splits it into different clusters. It's called divisive. And the other one is a bottom-up approach, which looks at the data separately and thinks of each data point in its own cluster and tries to merge different clusters together according to some similarity measure. So this is called agglomerative or bottom-up clustering. So the divisive one, the first step is we start with all the data in the same cluster. And we basically try to divide this big cluster into smaller clusters until we can't go anymore. So this division of each cluster into smaller clusters is done through a partitional clustering method, such as k-means. And we apply this second step until every data point is in its own cluster. So you can see how this can be very computationally expensive because we're applying k-means for sort of every cluster in this data. But this algorithm benefits from global information. So it first looks at all the data and then splits it into two. This won't be the case when we start with each data point in its own cluster and trying to merge them together. And it can be made efficient if we don't go until the very end where we have put each data point in its own cluster. Or if we use something efficient, a more efficient partitional method like k-means. So if we use spectral clustering, it would be a lot less efficient than if we use k-means. But it's still computationally expensive. OK, so the last type of clustering is agglomerative clustering, which starts from the bottom and tries to build a hierarchy. So it starts with each of the points in its own cluster. And then it finds which cluster to merge according to some kind of similarity metric. And we repeat the merging step until all data points are in the same cluster. So until we've reached this point here. OK, but how do we find which data points to merge? We start out with the similarity distance matrix. That contains the distances between all of our data points. So we have these 5 data points here, and we have the distance between the pairwise distances, right? So we see that the two closest points in our data set are these two sisters here. They have a distance of 1. And then the second closest are the mother and daughter here. So we start with this. And we try to merge, consider all possible merges first, and we choose the best one. So if we consider all possible merges here, we evaluate how similar, we want to merge the two objects that are most similar to each other, right? Which merge will be chosen? So which is the best merge? Which two objects are the closest? The sisters, right? So this one, exactly. So this is our first choice, exactly. But now what? We know how to compute distances between different objects. How do we compute different distances between different clusters? Like how do we compute the distance between this cluster and Marge? There are 3 ways to do this. One is to consider the distance between the 2 closest members in each class. Oh, you can't see this very well, but this is just looking at, these are the 2 closest members of these 2 classes, and these are the 2 closest members of these 2 classes. And it's choosing to merge these 2 clusters in this like very faint blue line, showing the clustering, the merging, because this distance is shorter than this distance. So this is called a single link. And it's not favorable because it can result in potentially long and skinny clusters, like sort of like this shape. Another way to do distances between clusters is to consider the 2 farthest points in the clusters. And this measure will merge these 2 clusters together because this distance is shorter than this distance here. And this results in tight clusters sometimes. So what we move on is the last measure, which is most widely used. And it's called the average link. So it's the average distance between all pairs of objects in 2 clusters. So it merges these 2 clusters here, because this average distance is shorter than this average distance.
Is that equivalent to the distance between 2 averages? Average of the points in the cluster?
The distance between 2 averages. 2 averages of what? Oh, I see. So make an average here, and make an average here, and the distance. I'm trying to think of a counterexample. Mm. Yes. Okay, let's trust you. But we can write out the math afterwards. Yeah. Okay, so this is robust against noise, and we use this metric most often. So now we have a way to compute the distances between clusters. It's the complete link. So let's go through this clustering. So first we choose this cluster because the 2 objects are close together. Then we choose the second closest objects. Then we compute the distances between the different clusters. And we choose to merge these 2. And we have our final cluster, right? So this is the bottom-up approach where we clustered all the data instances individually. Okay, so the hierarchical clustering takeaways. First, we with hierarchical clustering, we create a decomposition of the objects that's hierarchical. And there are 2 types, the bottom-up and the top-down. And unfortunately, neither is efficient. It's really efficient. But the upside is that we don't have to choose the number of clusters. And there's things we can do, like set the number of levels that we cluster at to make these algorithms more efficient. But if you're really interested in not having to specify a number of clusters, like in high-dimensional data, hierarchical clustering can be something that you look at. And then finally, so we're done with clustering. We saw that clustering can be useful when we have a lot of unlabeled data. But the way we evaluate clustering algorithms is not super clear. It's quite subjective. So what I mean by that is the clusters that result from the clustering algorithm can be ambiguous sometimes. And what is the best clustering can also be ambiguous because we don't have ground truth. We don't know what the actual cluster should be. And we've seen that it's important to understand the assumptions that go into these clustering algorithms. OK, so as a takeaway from the entire lecture, we have looked at unsupervised methods, which use unlabeled data. And we saw the dimensionality reduction can uncover these latent features that underlie our observations and better explain the variance in the data. And the clustering can group our different instances in ways that don't really require that much domain knowledge. OK, so next time, it's our last lecture, and we'll talk about advanced topics. So we'll discuss latent variable models, so sort of like HMMs, if you're familiar, so hidden Markov models. And we'll talk about reinforcement learning and deep learning. Yeah, so thank you for your attention.